and legendary Amiri Baraka.
This is an excerpt from a poem called Why Is We Americans? But reality is an excerpt on television. Why is we Americans? Why is we Americans? Boodee-da, 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 boodoo-doo. Good
evening. Welcome to another exciting program of the Queen's Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the Queen's Grapevine is going to be the spotlight on a great poet, civil rights activist, scholar, terrific guy, poet, writer, and someone who made a big difference in terms of the black community and other activities that he's done. Talking about one of the leaders in the black community that we recently lost in January, talking about the great playwright and poet, Amiri Baraka. It gives us a great deal of pleasure, of course, to be here at Lehman College, working with a gentleman that we have had the opportunity in the past to work with on various programs, and you, our viewing audience, have called us on many occasions asking for him to be part of our programs because of his input and stuff like that. And we feel that having him as a special guest tonight at Grapevine will give us a little bit of insight on when we talk about Mr. Baraka, who was also known as Leroy Jones, who passed away. Mr. Baraka was born, of course, in Newark, New Jersey, and for a while he lived in the village, where he became very well known, and from there he moved up to Harlem and then back to Newark, New Jersey. But as we move forward, you're going to find this very interesting. Just exactly who is Mr. Baraka? What does he bring to the table? And what his legacy is all about? I want to take the opportunity now on behalf of Grapevine to bring in our special guest, who happens to be Mr. Hank Williams from Lehman College. Welcome to our show, Mr. Williams.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It's always good to have you because we've done quite a few programs with you and we feel extremely comfortable with your input. Can you tell our viewing audience just exactly who's this iconic figure? Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka?
Well, Baraka, as you said, is born in 1934 to Newark, New Jersey. That's an important detail. His parents are middle class, and so he's raised in a fairly stable family. The Newark piece is important because you have to realize, especially at that time, it is obviously a northern city. It is in the process of becoming a majority black city that we know of right now, but it's essentially segregated, but in the particularly northern way that New York, to a lesser extent, and quite a few other cities are, in that there's a very large black population. You don't have people standing in the way of the schoolhouse like they do in the South, but the black community does not have a whole lot of formal power in the city. On the flip side, there's a lot of interaction between the two communities, in that case, primarily an Italian community. So Baraka grows up, and number one, he does have a fairly good grounding in black culture, and he's also comfortable and familiar with interacting with a wide variety of people, but he also begins to understand several things about how the country works in a very basic way. When he decides to, and he does fairly well in school, he's a bright student. When he decides to go to college, he gets accepted to Howard University.
Good school.
Which, absolutely. And at that point, again, your older audience will realize, your younger audience may not. There are a few black students going to the Harvards and Yales and that sort of thing of the world, but it's very, very few. So to go to Howard University, particularly for a black middle working class family, is really like having a child go to Harvard.
And at that time, too.
Exactly. College is not a good fit for Baraka for a whole variety of reasons, and he drops out fairly quickly for reasons that you can imagine. He's ashamed to go home and tell his parents that it doesn't work, so he joins the Air Force, which is also a particularly bad fit for him, as you'll get to know in a little bit. And he actually refers to it as the error farce in his autobiography. But it does a few things for him. Number one, it gives him a lot of time to read and think and just reflect. Two, it lets him travel a little bit and gives him a wider view of the world. And he begins a very long process of self-education it's going to continue his entire life. When he gets out of the Air Force, one of the things he's been reading about is the beat poetry movement, and he's extremely interested in that. And to make a much longer story short, he essentially goes directly to the East Village, which at that point is the heart of the beat movement, and it's also this incredible free artistic space. It is not the East Village that you know of right now that's highly gentrified, pretty much dominated by NYU. It's a very rough neighborhood. There are a lot of cheap places to live, which is one of the things that draws artists
to that place.
Exactly, but it's this real haven for creative people, primarily avant-garde jazz people, poets, visual artists, really all sorts of people.
And the freedom of expression too.
Yes. Yeah, so all sorts of people who are really just artistic misfits, but are interested in pushing the art as far as it can go. He marries a woman, Hetty Cohen, changes her name to Hetty Jones. They have children together.
Daughters.
One of which is Lisa Jones. The other one is Kelly Jones, who is now actually one of the top African American art scholars, in the country. And the next really big turning point for him comes in 1960, and he accepts an invitation to go to revolutionary Cuba right after Castro and his people have taken over.
Wow.
And it changes his world completely, because Cuba has become this magnet for politically conscious artists, particularly poets, but revolutionary-minded people all over South America. They essentially just say, come, and people flood there. And they're essentially creating this new society from scratch. And they're all young people. Fidel and Che Guevara are in their 30s, and that resonates a lot with Baraka. But more importantly than that, he gets challenged very strongly by a lot of the poets there, because at that point his writing is not the explicitly political work that we later know of him. And
because he was pretty young at the time too.
He's fairly young. He's still developing artistically, but he also has a sensibility of the beats. So he's not interested in doing very strictly formalistic work. But he doesn't have the essentially political sense, and more than that, he doesn't have a very strong revolutionary sensibility at the time. And they challenge him. They say, as a black man in this country, at this time, the same year that the sit-ins occur in North Carolina, and you have this strong, powerful voice, people listen to you, how can you not be writing conscious work? And Baraka, and it takes a little while to sink in. And he writes this essay that sums it up, called Cuba Libre, that people can go online and find.
But that must have been also a shock to him, coming from the Cubans saying to him, express yourself, and
Yes.
just the way how you feel.
Yes, and it's a needed shock. And he comes back to the United States and begins to very formally change his writing, and he's doing reading and study the entire time. The next big watershed is the assassination of Malcolm X. And it shakes a lot of people, but it particularly shakes Baraka, because he had been, he and some other black artists in the village have been reading and doing some study and essentially asking what can they actually do for the movement. And all of a sudden it catalyzes and kicks into place a lot of things he had been working on. And he leaves his wife and children in Greenwich Village, goes up to Harlem and sets up operation called the Black Arts Repertory Theater and School, shorthand BARTS. It is a very short-lived operation, but he learns quite a bit from it. He also releases two incredibly important plays that maybe we can go back to later, The Dutchman and The Slave. Dutchman wins an Obie Award. The Slave is essentially committing literary suicide by him because he formally cuts his ties with the Beat movement and
Totally.
yes, and with the literary establishment at that time. And after that, he goes back to his hometown of Newark, New Jersey, and he begins. He meets a woman there, Amiri Baraka, now Amiri Baraka, who is his wife until he transitioned, and he begins organizing out there, and he is extremely influential in the successful mayoral run of Kenneth Gibson, the first black mayor out there, and going forward from that.
I find it extremely interesting, his background. We need to talk a little bit about it so people who are watching the program understand what this country used to be like in the 50s and early 60s for anyone of color or Latino. You basically were just yesterday's news, and you have people who stood up to representing the movement for the thing that they believe, like in Malcolm. Back then, CBS, NBC, all these places present Malcolm as a bad nut, a no good, he's dangerous. Today, everybody embraced Malcolm. But at the time when Malcolm was talking about by any means necessary and fighting for the rights of black people and minorities, he was looked at as anti-American. Same thing goes for Baraka here. These are guys that make no mistake about it. They knew exactly what we're talking about, and you influentially talk about him going to Cuba and basically coming alive as a person and learning something about himself and what is needed to confront what was taking place here. You also mentioned him being in the Army. It's important to know that for whatever reason he got an dishonorable discharge, but how much he learned from it. What do you think his legacy in the long run will be?
His legacy is a huge one, and quite honestly, I think it depends quite a bit on how we tell his story. He's an extremely complex individual as he goes through a lot of changes in his life, and for anybody who has a very long record of writing and publication and creative work, there's going to be a lot of things to sort out. And the thing you have to realize, he's known primarily as a poet, but he's a poet, he's a playwright, he even dabbles in a little bit of film. He's a political organizer, and a very effective one at that. And that's something he does for his entire life. They were one of the stories that his son Ras, who's now mayor of Newark, New Jersey, tells is of his father being in the hospital and actually handing pamphlets to people saying, my son is running for mayor, vote for him. So he is a huge legacy for us to sort through. Fortunately, a lot of it is documented. He's a controversial figure because of some of the things he wrote and said early in his career, and it's I think you definitely have to look at him as really one of the key people in terms of the late 20th century and African American history.
Well, I love one of the things that earlier you started talking about when you talk about how Newark, New Jersey. It's important to understand the description, how you describe it, and it's exactly what was taking place of the division in Newark, New Jersey, who happens to be a town that's been through a whole lot. And he was born and raised there, while he left there and went to the village and got really the exposition that he needed in the village. And you also explain the village for those who are youngsters that don't understand the village, man. That was the place to be in the 50s and 60s, the hippie movement. the music coming out of the village, the poetry, the playwrights and stuff like that. And a lot of people don't understand how important the village was to him. How key was the village to him for his development in your experience?
Village is extremely important because it's where he first begins to develop and get notoriety, as a creative artist. Primarily as a writer, he begins editing a small literary journal with his wife Hetty Jones. And and he begins to get notoriety there because he solicits and gets work from key people in the beat movement, such as Allen Ginsberg and others. He also begins writing jazz criticism, and part of the reason he's able to do that is he is essentially in on the ground floor of what's then called, quote unquote, the new thing, and we now know as free jazz or avant-garde jazz. The standard bearers of that probably being the late work of John Coltrane. Archie Shepp, but he's essentially around as Shepp and people like that are beginning to get known, and the two, and all of them are running in those circles. Sun Ra and his orchestra spend a period of time in the village as well. So it's the type of thing where he is formally and informally encouraged and gets the opportunity to really hone his craft as not just a poet, but a jazz critic, a writer, and begins primarily on his own, but also begins to develop politically as well.
It's important to note that he was probably one of the first black writers that brought the importance of jazz. Professionally talking about jazz, and that a lot of people talk about jazz and stuff like that, but he was one of the first black writers. Also, it's important to note when we talk about the village, how difficult it was for his wife, who's from the Jewish background, when she first married him, how her family reacted to that and what both of them went through. That must have been a very difficult period of time, because we're talking about they got married in the late 50s.
Right.
So that had to be very tough. The racist behavior of this nation, so you can imagine what they went through at the period of time when they first got married and so young. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is, he writes in his autobiography, and actually Hetty Jones corroborates it in her own autobiography, that her parents have a lot of problems with the marriage. Interestingly, Baraka's parents don't. And they both describe going back and visiting his parents in Newark every once in a while, and being fairly warmly received, which I think is a real interesting detail to note. But they have, particularly after they have children, they very soon begin to run into the full repercussions of what all that means in the country at that time, even in a place like New York City. And even in Greenwich Village, and you have to remember, you're only talking maybe a little bit over a decade, maybe a decade and a half after Richard Wright, permanently moves to France. Basically making the decision that he cannot raise mixed race children in this country without them being extremely damaged by the experience that they're going through.
As we continue here moving forward talking about this great writer, poet, civil rights activist, Baraka, we'll be right back on the Queen's Grapevine as we continue talking about him, and more importantly, a little bit about his background. Most of you must know by now that he died in January of this year, 2014, at 79 years old. We'll be right back on the Grapevine as we continue moving forward talking about his background.
Baraka was emerging as a dynamic and outspoken leader of the Black Arts Movement.
Come out, niggas, 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 come out. Help us stop the devil. Help us build a new world, niggas. Come out, brothers. Are we with you, and your sons, your daughters are ours, and we are the same, all the blackness from one black Allah. When the world is clear, you'll be with us. Come out, niggas, come out. Come on, niggas, come out. It's nation time. It's nation time. It's nation time. It's nation time. Chant with bells and drums. Nation time. It's nation time. Get up, Santa Claus. Get up, Roy Wilkins. Get up, Dinah Ross. population.
If you ever see the boy from me.
And we're back here in the Queen's Grapevine as we continue exploring and talking about the life and times of Amiri Baraka, a great poet, playwright, activist, scholar, very educated man that has left a tremendous legacy for us to look at. Man extremely complex in more ways than one who has changed his name in various occasions, and I'm sure he has a reason why. You know, again, he leaves a great legacy with books and things and people who he has touched in the past. He has had his confrontation with the law like any other one in those times that was born in the 30s and made a difference here in the 50s and 60s. There are those who love him crazily and those who have some concern about him. As we move forward, let's talk a little bit. How important was Brother Malcolm X in terms of Baraka? How did he influence him and how important that was?
Malcolm is an extremely important influence on Baraka and really just about all the other figures you're going to run into in the Black Arts movement and the Black Power movement. And Baraka is of the generation that's slightly younger rather than the civil rights generation. You know, so he's born not quite 10 years after Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he's born in the North. So those are two very important factors. Number one, you know, and Baraka would say, we love Dr. King dearly, but Malcolm was the one who really spoke and resonated to us. And there's a reason for that, because in the North, things had progressed to the point where some of the basic rights people were fighting for in the South, such as just the right to vote or the right to even work wherever you want, people already had, but there were more formal and institutional structures in place that kept black people from actually achieving a certain amount of power. And Malcolm understands that and begins to articulate a more forward sense of thinking. And Malcolm also very much comes from and understands the Northern experience. And in the wake of Malcolm's assassination, where he doesn't, unfortunately, he doesn't actually get to present the fuller program that he has for a political organization, which ironically he was planning to present that on the very day he was assassinated. Baraka and several other people begin to pick up where Malcolm has been left off. It is very much a catalyzing moment for the movement, and it crystallizes for Baraka and several other people the need to actually immediately go and try to take the movement forward and try to figure out exactly what Malcolm meant and what Malcolm's teachings might mean if concretely put into place. And that's the thing that precipitates his move up to Harlem, his turn to black nationalism as a political philosophy, and a much sharper turn in terms of not just his politics, but in terms of his artistic output too.
You know what is interesting about all of this? Malcolm was one of the first person I ever heard talking about the system. And at the time, a lot of people did not zero in on this. The way how the system operates, the way how you have to work into the system and understand it and how it oppresses you. Malcolm was the first person, and if you listen to a lot of his speeches, he would constantly talk to you about the system. Do you think that young America today understand, after going back and looking at Malcolm, about what the system was all about?
Excellent question. Short answer is not enough of us do. And some of Malcolm's work it honestly still remains extremely fresh and extremely prescient, even if you just listen to his analysis of what's happening in the Congo. If you reread his ballot or the bullet speech, which is really, less about what the title might suggest, but much more about how are you going to look at voting as a strategy. And are you actually going to understand the system that we're in and how the system works and the role voting plays in that strategy, which, interestingly enough, a lot of people were going and rereading around the first election of Barack Obama, and in several ways, Malcolm's analysis was still extremely relevant and still very helpful.
Very much interesting. As we continue moving forward, we're talking about the life and the legacy that Baraka has left behind in his poetry and the booksoms and the playwrights and things that he confronted and that he was not afraid of dealing with. We talked a little bit about him coming from Newark, New Jersey to New York City, to the village, from the village back up to Harlem. And we talked a little bit about the power and the influence that Malcolm had on him and the importance of some of the words that Malcolm left behind, and more importantly, some of the books that Baraka wrote. I mean, they're right there to educate your mind, to let you know what he's all about. And more importantly, yes, he left a great legacy, but he also, there are a couple of people in America that took him as a threat. Do you think America, overall, took him as a threat?
Absolutely. He's during the Newark Rebellion in 1967. He is beaten up, arrested by the police. He says that were it not for a couple bystanders coming on, he feels they very likely would have killed him. And I think people realize that not just his work wasn't only dangerous artistically, in terms of how it challenged people to think and how it challenged the status quo. He was also dangerous politically in terms of the ideas that he was getting out.
And how he felt.
Exactly.
All right. Again, this is part one of the Spotlight and Amiri Baraka. We're going to sign off now, and part two will follow up for those of you who have followed the Grapevine. So as such, we'll say good night right now for the part one, but we'll be back with a part two talking about that great poet, civil rights leader, and scholar, Amiri Baraka.
Who is me and the what it is and who it is and when it me is what it be. I'm going to be here if I want, like I said, self-determination. But I ain't come from a foolish tribe. We wants the mule, the land. You can make it 300 years of blue chip stock in the entire operation. We want to be paid in a central bank, the average worker farmer wage for all those years we gave it free. Plus we want damages for all the killings and the fraud, the lynchings, the missing justice, the lies and frame-ups, unwarranted jailings, the tar and featherings, the character and race assassinations, historical slander, ugly caricatures for every Sambo, steppin', fetch it, flick.